The first frost came early that year, creeping over the hills before the leaves had fully surrendered their color. It settled into the cracks of the cabin like a quiet warning, touching the window glass with pale fingers and stiffening the earth outside until every step rang hollow. Inside, the fire still burned strong, and she believed, as most people do when warmth surrounds them, that winter could be managed with patience and hard work alone. The cabin stood far from any proper road, tucked between tall pines that whispered even when the wind barely moved. It had been raised by rough hands many years before she ever saw it. Built from logs cut nearby and stones hauled one by one from the riverbed. Nothing about it was delicate. The walls were thick, the beams uneven, and the floor carried the scars of boots, tools, and seasons that had come and gone without ceremony. It was not meant to impress anyone. It was meant to endure. She had come there at the end of autumn with only what fit into a wagon and what she could carry in her arms. A cast-iron stove waited in the center of the main room, heavy and dependable, or so she had been told. The man who sold her the place spoke proudly of it, saying it had warmed 3 generations through blizzards that buried barns and froze rivers solid. She trusted that story because she needed to trust something. Life in the cabin followed a steady rhythm. Morning began before sunrise, when the cold felt sharpest and the stove demanded feeding. She learned quickly how wood must be stacked to burn long, how ash should be cleared without stirring too much dust, and how to listen for the subtle shift in flame that meant the fire was fading. Each task became familiar, almost comforting, like repeating a prayer learned in childhood. Outside, winter gathered strength. Snow fell lightly at first, drifting across the clearing in thin sheets. Then came heavier storms that erased paths and softened every edge of the land. The world shrank to the distance she could walk before her breath grew thin and her fingers numbed. The nearest neighbor lived miles away, and visits were rare once the snow deepened. Silence became her closest companion. Evenings were the hardest. Darkness arrived early, pressing against the windows while the wind tested every seam in the walls. She often sat near the stove, mending clothes or carving small wooden tools by lamplight, listening to the fire crackle. The sound filled the room with reassurance. As long as the stove burned, she felt secure. Heat meant survival. Heat meant morning would come. Yet she noticed things others might have ignored. Cold drafts slipped along the floor no matter how fiercely the stove burned. The stone wall behind it never quite warmed, holding a chill that lingered even after hours of fire. One night, while placing another log inside, she pressed her hand against those stones and felt how deeply cold lived within them. The thought came without much planning. Stones held heat when left in the sun during summer. She had felt it herself countless times while walking riverbanks barefoot. If stones could keep warmth, perhaps they could help the cabin hold it longer through the night. It was not an idea born from knowledge or instruction. It came from observation, from necessity, from the quiet stubbornness that grows in people who must rely on their own hands. The next day she began carrying rocks indoors. They were heavier than she expected. Each trip from the frozen yard left her shoulders aching, her breath fogging thick in the air. She chose rounded stones, dense and smooth, stacking them carefully along the wall behind the stove. At first it looked foolish, like a child's attempt at building something without purpose. But she kept going, fitting each stone tightly against the next, filling gaps with smaller pieces until the wall thickened. Days passed as she worked between chores. The growing structure rose slowly, forming a broad barrier of stone that wrapped partially around the back of the iron stove. Dust covered her skirt, and her hands grew rough from cold and weight, but she felt a quiet satisfaction watching it take shape. The cabin began to look older somehow, as if the wall had always belonged there. When she finally finished, she lit the evening fire and waited. At first nothing seemed different. Flames danced behind the stove door, and warmth spread as usual. But hours later, when the fire burned low and the room should have cooled quickly, she noticed the air remained gentle against her skin. The stones behind the stove radiated a slow, steady heat. She touched them carefully and smiled at the warmth lingering there. It felt like a small victory, one no one else would ever see. Winter deepened. Snow piled against the cabin walls, sealing cracks and muting the outside world. Nights grew longer, and storms arrived with a force that rattled shutters and bent trees. During one fierce windstorm, the chimney howled like a living thing, sending sparks swirling upward into darkness. She stayed awake that night, feeding the fire again and again, unwilling to risk the cold creeping in. The heat wall proved its worth during those restless hours. Even when the flames faded, warmth remained trapped within the stones, easing the sharp edge of the cold. She slept better knowing the cabin would not freeze the moment the fire dimmed. The simple addition changed the way the room felt, making it steadier, more forgiving. Still, the iron stove worked harder as temperatures fell. She began noticing small signs of strain. The door hinge squealed faintly when opened. A thin line appeared along one side where metal met metal, barely visible beneath soot. Once or twice, smoke slipped into the room before rising properly through the chimney. She told herself it was nothing, only winter testing old equipment. The storms grew harsher by mid-season. Snow buried the woodpile faster than expected, forcing her to dig paths each morning just to reach fuel. The sky often stayed gray for days, casting a dull light that made time difficult to measure. Loneliness pressed closer during those stretches, and she spoke aloud sometimes just to hear a voice. One evening, after hauling in an armful of logs, she paused near the stone wall. Heat flowed from it steadily, stronger than before. She leaned her back against the stones and closed her eyes, grateful for the warmth soaking through her clothes. In that moment she felt certain she had outsmarted winter itself. Outside, the wind shifted. It arrived suddenly, sharper and colder than anything before, carrying snow that struck the cabin like handfuls of sand. The chimney groaned under the force. Flames inside the stove flickered unevenly, pulling sideways as if struggling to breathe. She adjusted the draft and added another log, watching carefully until the fire steadied. But the sound of the wind did not fade. It deepened into a roar that filled every corner of the cabin. Snow forced itself through tiny openings around the window frame, melting into thin lines of water along the sill. The temperature dropped quickly, faster than she had ever felt. Then came a sound that froze her in place. A sharp crack echoed from the stove, loud enough to silence even the storm in her thoughts. The fire flared suddenly, then dimmed. She stepped closer, heart pounding, unsure whether she imagined it. Another sound followed, softer but unmistakable, like metal giving way under pressure. The warmth in the room began to change. She opened the stove door cautiously, expecting to adjust the wood, but something felt wrong. The flames burned unevenly, licking toward one side where the iron glowed too brightly. A faint smell, harsh and unfamiliar, drifted into the air. She shut the door quickly, staring at the stove as if it might explain itself. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the cabin walls. For the first time since arriving, she felt true fear settle into her chest. The stove was more than comfort. It was survival. Without it, the cold would claim the cabin before morning. She looked toward the stacked wood, then toward the thick stone wall she had built with tired hands and simple hope. Another crack sounded, longer this time. The fire inside faltered, and a thin thread of smoke slipped into the room, curling upward toward the ceiling. She stepped back instinctively, realizing something inside the iron body had failed. The stove that had promised safety now threatened to abandon her in the worst storm of the season. The air cooled by the second. She wrapped her shawl tighter, eyes moving between the failing stove and the silent stones behind it, still holding the day's warmth deep within their mass. Outside, the storm showed no mercy, sealing her away from help or escape. And as the fire weakened and the cold began its slow advance, she understood that whatever happened next would decide whether the cabin remained a refuge or became a frozen trap. The cold crept forward carefully, almost politely at first, as if testing whether it truly had permission to enter. She stood still beside the stove, listening to the uneven breathing of the fire inside it. The iron casing ticked and shifted, a sound she had never heard before. Heat no longer spread evenly through the room. One side burned too hot while the rest faded into chill. She moved closer again, slower this time. The faint line she had noticed days earlier had widened into something darker, a thin crack running along the stove's side. A dim glow leaked through it, pulsing whenever the flames stirred. Smoke curled faintly from the seam, carrying a bitter scent that tightened her throat. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the cabin walls. Snow struck the window in sharp bursts, and wind forced its way down the chimney, confusing the draft. The fire struggled, shrinking and flaring without rhythm. She adjusted the vent again, hands steady only because panic would not help her now. The room felt different already. The steady comfort she had grown used to was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Every sound carried weight. Every shift in temperature felt personal. She stepped back and turned toward the stone wall. Heat still radiated from it, slow and patient. When she placed her palm against the rocks, warmth greeted her skin, reassuring but limited. The stones held what the fire had given earlier, nothing more. They could not create heat, only remember it. That thought stayed with her. She pulled a chair closer and sat facing the stove, watching carefully. The crack widened slightly as metal expanded under uneven heat. Another faint pop echoed, followed by a whisper of smoke. If the stove split fully, sparks could spill into the room. If the fire died entirely, the cold would take over before dawn. She remembered the man who had sold her the cabin, his weathered face and confident voice promising reliability. He had spoken of winters survived, of storms endured, but he had also mentioned something else in passing. The stove, he said, had once required repair after a brutal season long before her arrival. At the time she paid little attention. Now the memory returned sharply. Old iron carried old weaknesses. She rose and checked the woodpile inside. Enough logs remained for several days if burned carefully. That knowledge should have comforted her, yet it did not. Fuel meant nothing if the stove could not contain fire safely. A gust slammed against the cabin, rattling the door hard enough to make her flinch. Snow sifted down from the rafters in fine powder. The storm showed no sign of easing. Even if she attempted to leave, darkness and drifting snow would swallow the path within minutes. She wrapped cloth around her hands and opened the stove door cautiously. Flames flickered weakly now, drawn unevenly toward the cracked side. She used the poker to shift a log, trying to balance the burn. Sparks jumped upward, and for a moment the fire brightened, throwing long shadows across the stone wall. The stones glowed softly in response, holding the light as much as the heat. She noticed how the warmth near them remained steady while the rest of the room cooled faster. The difference was small but undeniable. Her thoughts drifted back to autumn, to the days before snow when she first arrived. The cabin had felt empty then, filled with echoes of lives lived before hers. She remembered sweeping dust from corners and finding old nails, worn tools, and a rusted kettle left behind. Each object hinted at people who had once depended on this place just as she did now. One afternoon during those early weeks, she discovered a small stack of flat stones behind the cabin, half buried under weeds. They had been arranged deliberately, not scattered naturally. She assumed they were leftovers from construction and thought nothing more of it. Now she wondered who had placed them there and why. Perhaps others had fought the cold in their own ways. The wind howled again, dragging her attention back to the present. The fire dipped lower, and shadows thickened around the edges of the room. She added another log carefully, avoiding sudden movement that might stress the cracked iron. The flames caught slowly, uncertain but alive. She sat again, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Time stretched strangely during storms. Minutes felt long, measured only by the sound of wind and the fading strength of fire. Her gaze returned to the stone wall. She studied how it absorbed warmth closest to the stove while remaining cooler toward the edges. An idea formed quietly, not yet complete. If the stove failed entirely, the stored heat might buy her time. But how much time remained trapped inside those stones? She stood and moved around the cabin, gathering blankets and hanging them near doorways to slow drafts. She blocked gaps near the floor with folded cloth and pushed furniture closer to the warmer side of the room. Each action felt small, yet purposeful. Survival often depended on small decisions made early enough. The smoke smell grew stronger. She turned quickly. A faint gray line escaped the crack again, drifting upward before disappearing. Her chest tightened. Breathing smoke for long would weaken her before the cold ever could. She opened the window slightly, despite the storm, allowing a thin ribbon of freezing air inside to carry the smoke away. Cold rushed in immediately, biting her face, but the air cleared. The storm outside sounded endless, as though the world beyond the cabin had vanished beneath snow and wind. Isolation settled heavier than before. No traveler would pass tonight. No lantern light would appear in the distance. Whatever happened would unfold without witness. She remembered winters from childhood spent in smaller shelters where heat came from open hearths rather than iron stoves. Elders had spoken about stone retaining warmth long after flames died. Back then, she listened without imagining she would depend on such knowledge herself. Now those memories felt like instructions passed quietly through time. She knelt beside the stone wall and pressed her ear gently against it. At first she heard nothing, then a faint ticking as heat shifted within the rocks. The sound reminded her of cooling earth after sunset, steady and patient. The stove gave another sharp noise behind her. She turned just in time to see a tiny spark escape through the crack and fall harmlessly onto the metal base below. Her heartbeat quickened. If the opening widened further, sparks could reach the wooden floor. Fear sharpened her thoughts. She grabbed a metal pan and placed it beneath the crack as a precaution. Then she moved extra stones closer, stacking them carefully around the vulnerable side without touching the stove itself. The work steadied her nerves. Action felt better than waiting. As she worked, she noticed soot patterns on the wall behind the stove, faint marks left from years of use. The previous occupants had clearly adjusted the stove many times, judging by scratches and worn spots near the vents. This cabin had seen struggle before her arrival. The realization comforted her slightly. Others had faced danger here and endured. Hours passed slowly. The fire weakened, despite her efforts, unable to burn properly with a damaged draft. Heat from the stove faded, leaving the stone wall as the room's main source of warmth. The air grew colder away from it, forming invisible boundaries she could feel when moving across the floor. She dragged her bedding closer to the stones, preparing for the possibility that the stove might die completely. The idea frightened her, yet preparation made it manageable. While arranging blankets, she found an old carving tucked between floorboards near the wall, something she had never noticed before. It was a small wooden piece shaped roughly like a square, its surface marked with shallow lines forming a pattern. She turned it in her hands, puzzled. It looked deliberate, almost instructional, though she could not immediately understand its purpose. Perhaps it belonged to whoever lived here long ago. A sudden gust roared down the chimney, forcing ash outward inside the stove. The flames sputtered violently. She shut the vent halfway, trying to calm the fire, but the damage was already done. The crack glowed brighter for a moment, then dimmed as the fire lost strength. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain. She sat near the stones, watching carefully, counting breaths without realizing it. The warmth against her back felt precious now, something measured rather than assumed. Every degree of heat mattered. Her thoughts wandered again to why she had come to this cabin at all. Leaving behind crowded towns and familiar voices had not been easy, yet she needed distance, needed a place where effort directly shaped survival. Out here, success or failure belonged entirely to her hands. The storm outside reminded her that nature cared little for intention. Another faint creak came from the stove, softer this time, almost like surrender. The flames shrank further, their light flickering weakly across the room. Shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped enough for her breath to show faintly in the air. She pulled the blankets around herself and leaned against the stone wall. Warmth still flowed from it, steady and calm, contrasting with the failing iron beside her. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength, listening to wind, fire, and stone as if they were voices arguing over her fate. The mystery of the cabin pressed closer in her thoughts. Who first understood the value of stone here? Had someone before her built something similar and removed it later, or had she unknowingly repeated an old solution born from desperation? The carved wooden piece rested in her palm, its grooves catching firelight. She traced the pattern slowly, sensing it meant more than decoration, though its meaning remained just beyond understanding. Behind her, the stone wall continued releasing stored heat into the cold room, one quiet breath at a time. And as the fire dwindled further and the storm tightened its grip outside, she realized the night was far from over, and whatever secret the cabin held had not yet revealed its true purpose. The fire finally dropped into a bed of dull embers, glowing weakly like fading stars. She watched them carefully, hoping they might gather strength again, but the stove no longer breathed the way it should. The draft had failed almost completely. Heat no longer moved outward with purpose. Instead, it lingered close to the iron shell, trapped and uneven. The cabin answered immediately. Cold slid down from the rafters and stretched across the floorboards. The difference was sudden enough to make her sit upright. The storm outside had grown fiercer, wind circling the cabin in restless bursts that made the walls creak as if remembering older winters. She pulled her blankets tighter and shifted closer to the stone wall. Warmth still pressed gently against her back, steady and calm. The stones had become the heart of the room now. Without them, the cold would already have taken control. She glanced at the iron stove again. It stood silent except for occasional ticking as metal cooled. Smoke no longer leaked from the crack, which worried her more than before. Smoke meant fire still fought to live. Silence meant surrender. The carved wooden piece remained in her hand. She studied it again in the dim light. The shallow lines formed a pattern of squares within squares, almost like a map or a plan drawn by someone who understood structure better than decoration. Her thumb followed the grooves slowly, and she began to wonder if it represented the cabin itself. A memory stirred faintly. When she first arrived, she noticed unusual thickness behind the stove wall compared to the rest of the cabin. At the time, she assumed it was simply extra insulation against winter wind. Now the thought returned with urgency. She stood and examined the stones more closely, holding the small carving beside them. The pattern seemed familiar. Larger shapes surrounded by smaller ones. Layers meant to hold something inside. Heat, the realization unsettled her. Perhaps the wall she built was not entirely new. Perhaps she had unknowingly completed something started long ago. Outside, a violent gust struck the cabin hard enough to shake loose snow from the roof. The sound rolled like thunder overhead. She instinctively reached toward the stove, then stopped herself. The iron felt colder already when she hovered her hand near it. She paced slowly, trying to keep her blood moving. The cold crept deeper now, touching her fingers and toes despite the blankets. Survival depended not only on warmth but on staying awake and alert. Sleep could come too easily in freezing air. Her thoughts drifted to the previous owner again. He had spoken carefully when describing winters here, choosing words that sounded reassuring while avoiding details. She remembered asking why the cabin had changed hands so often despite its sturdy build. He shrugged and said isolation was not for everyone. At the time she accepted that answer. Now it felt incomplete. She moved toward the back corner where supplies were stored and searched through a small wooden chest left behind by earlier occupants. Inside she found worn tools, bent nails, and folded scraps of paper too faded to read clearly. One sheet held faint pencil marks, lines drawn in rough shapes resembling walls and measurements. Her pulse quickened. The drawing showed a stove placed before a thick structure labeled only with a single word she could barely make out. The letters were smudged but recognizable enough to understand. Heat. She looked back at her stone wall, then at the drawing again. Whoever lived here before had understood something important. The wall was never meant to be decoration or simple reinforcement. It had purpose. The storm roared louder, as if urging her to hurry. She returned to the stones and pressed both hands against them. They remained warm, though slightly less than before. Heat escaped slowly into the room, buying her time. She realized the wall worked like a reservoir, storing warmth during strong fire hours and releasing it gradually when flames faded. But how long could it last without new heat feeding it? Her stomach tightened at the thought. Dawn was still far away. Even if the storm passed by morning, surviving the night remained uncertain. A sudden noise outside interrupted her thoughts. Not wind this time. Something heavier, dull, and rhythmic beneath the storm's howl. She froze, listening carefully. The sound came again, faint but distinct, like shifting snow or a branch collapsing under weight. For a brief moment she imagined another person approaching, perhaps a traveler seeking shelter. The idea felt impossible in such weather, yet hope stirred anyway. She moved toward the window and wiped frost from the glass. Nothing waited beyond the swirling snow. Only darkness and moving white shapes carried by wind. She stayed there longer than necessary, listening for any sign of life, but the storm swallowed all sound except its own fury. Isolation returned heavier than before. Turning back, she noticed the temperature difference more sharply now. The far side of the cabin had grown bitterly cold, while the area near the stone wall remained bearable. Invisible lines divided survival from danger within a single room. She dragged more belongings toward the warmer area, creating a small living space close to the stones. Each movement felt deliberate, guided by instinct rather than fear. As she worked, another thought troubled her. If previous occupants built this system, why leave the carved guide behind? Why not teach the next owner directly, unless something prevented them? Her mind filled with possibilities she could not confirm: harsh winters, sudden departures. Perhaps the knowledge had simply been forgotten over time, reduced to scattered clues waiting for someone desperate enough to notice. The embers inside the stove dimmed further, barely glowing now. Darkness deepened across the cabin, forcing her to light a small oil lamp. The flame flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows that made the stone wall appear almost alive. She sat again and watched the heat slowly leave the rocks. The change was gradual but undeniable. Warmth softened, fading degree by degree. Anxiety pressed closer. She considered trying to relight the fire, but fear stopped her. If the stove cracked further, sparks could escape uncontrollably. Fire might spread to the wooden walls faster than she could react. The risk felt too great. Instead, she focused on conserving warmth. She wrapped extra cloth around her feet and hands, then leaned fully against the stones, allowing their stored heat to reach her core. Time moved strangely. Minutes stretched into long, quiet stretches broken only by wind and the occasional groan of timber adjusting to cold. Her thoughts wandered to stories she once heard about frontier winters, about families surviving by ingenuity rather than strength. People learned to use what surrounded them, turning earth, stone, and wood into protection against elements stronger than any single person. She wondered whether survival depended less on preparation and more on noticing small truths before it was too late. The carved wooden piece rested beside her. She traced its pattern again, suddenly realizing the shapes aligned not only with the wall but with airflow around the stove. Perhaps the design guided heat circulation rather than simple storage. She looked toward the chimney, then back at the stones. An idea formed, uncertain but persistent. Maybe the wall worked best when heat moved across it evenly. Maybe something about the stove's placement once allowed greater contact. But the damaged iron prevented testing that theory now. A powerful gust slammed against the cabin again, louder than any before. Snow forced itself through the partly opened window, scattering across the floor. She rushed to close it, hands trembling from cold, and secured the latch tightly. When she turned back, she noticed frost forming along the edges of the stove itself. The sight unsettled her deeply. Iron that once radiated warmth now attracted cold. She approached cautiously and placed her hand near the crack. Barely any heat remained. The stove had failed completely. Silence filled the room except for the storm. She stood there for a long moment, absorbing the reality. The cabin's survival no longer depended on fire, but on whatever heat remained, stored in the stone wall she built without fully understanding why. A strange mixture of fear and determination settled inside her. She realized she was now part of a longer story tied to this place, connected to unknown hands that shaped solutions before her arrival. The stones behind her continued releasing warmth slowly, patiently resisting the cold's advance. But as the night deepened and the storm showed no sign of mercy, she began to wonder whether the wall was meant only to delay the inevitable or whether it hid another purpose she had yet to discover. And somewhere beneath that thought lingered a growing question that refused to leave her mind. If the wall saved others before her, what danger had forced them to need saving in the first place? The cold settled deeper into the cabin, no longer cautious. It moved with certainty now, filling corners, creeping along the ceiling beams, slipping through the smallest gaps in the logs. She could feel it pressing against her skin even through layers of wool. The storm outside roared as if determined to erase every sign of warmth from the world. She stayed close to the stone wall, listening to the quiet pulse of heat still escaping from it. The warmth was weaker than before, but steady enough to keep feeling in her hands. Each breath formed a pale cloud in front of her face. The oil lamp flickered beside her, its small flame fighting its own fragile battle against drafts. The failed iron stove stood nearby like a fallen guard. Frost gathered along its edges, turning the once dependable metal dull and lifeless. She avoided looking at it for long, trusting it had nearly cost her everything. Instead, she focused on the stones. She pressed both palms against them again, closing her eyes. Heat remained trapped deep inside, not fading as quickly as she feared. The wall was doing something more than simply cooling slowly. The warmth seemed to move across its surface in waves, stronger near the center and spreading outward. Her thoughts returned to the carved wooden piece. She picked it up and studied the pattern under the lamp's light. The shapes resembled channels or layers, almost suggesting direction rather than decoration. Whoever carved it had been trying to explain something without words. She stood and examined the wall carefully, tracing the arrangement of stones she had stacked weeks earlier. Some rocks felt warmer than others. She noticed that the stones closest to the stove's former hottest point still held strong heat, while those farther away cooled faster. A realization formed slowly. The wall was not complete. She remembered how she stopped building once the structure felt large enough. She never questioned whether its shape mattered. Now she wondered if the design required balance, a specific arrangement to distribute warmth throughout the cabin. The storm rattled the roof violently, pulling her attention back. Snow slid heavily outside, thudding against the walls. The sound reminded her how much weight surrounded the cabin now. Leaving was impossible until morning, if morning even brought calm. She paced carefully to keep warm, counting steps between breaths. Movement helped, but exhaustion pressed against her shoulders. She had not slept properly since the stove first cracked. Her body urged rest, yet she knew sleep could steal the little heat she still had. She began rearranging loose stones near the wall, guided by instinct and the carving's pattern. One by one, she shifted smaller rocks into gaps, extending the structure slightly along the floor. The work warmed her muscles and sharpened her focus. As she worked, she noticed something unexpected. Air near the stones felt less cold, almost circulating gently upward. She held the lamp closer and saw faint movement in the flame, drawn toward the wall rather than away from it. The stones were influencing airflow. She crouched lower, studying the space between the wall and the cabin logs. A narrow gap remained there, one she had ignored before. Warm air rose through it slowly, spreading along the wooden surface before drifting outward. The wall was not only storing heat, it was guiding it. Her heart quickened with cautious hope. She adjusted more stones, shaping the lower edge according to the carving's pattern. Each movement felt like following instructions left by unseen hands. The warmth began spreading more evenly across the immediate space, subtle but noticeable. Still, the temperature continued dropping overall. The stored heat would not last forever. A loud crack from outside startled her. She froze, listening. The sound came again, deeper this time, followed by a heavy sliding noise. Snow shifting from the roof, she realized, though the weight pressing against the cabin worried her. If drifts blocked the chimney completely or sealed the door, escape later could become impossible. She moved to the door and pushed gently. It resisted slightly but held. Snow pressed heavily against it from outside. Anxiety tightened her chest. The cabin was becoming a sealed pocket within the storm. Returning to the stone wall, she leaned against it again, absorbing warmth while thinking quickly. The carving must have been important enough for someone to leave behind deliberately. Perhaps they expected future occupants to understand its purpose during danger. She examined the carving once more and noticed small marks she had missed earlier. Tiny notches along one edge formed a sequence, almost like counting marks. Her eyes moved between the notches and the stones she had placed. Layers, the wall might require thickness, not just width. She stood and searched for additional stones stored indoors. A few remained near the corner, carried in earlier but never used. She brought them over and carefully added another layer to the warmest section of the wall, stacking them tightly. As she finished, she waited. Minutes passed. At first nothing changed. Then slowly, warmth began lingering longer near her shoulders instead of rising immediately toward the ceiling. The air felt heavier with heat, less eager to escape. A small smile appeared despite her exhaustion. The wall responded to change. Outside, the storm reached a furious peak. Wind screamed through the trees and the cabin groaned under pressure. Snow struck the windows relentlessly. Darkness beyond the glass felt absolute, as if the world itself had vanished. Inside, she worked steadily, adjusting stones wherever the carving suggested balance. Her hands numbed repeatedly, forcing her to pause and warm them against the wall before continuing. Each adjustment felt like a gamble against time. Memories surfaced while she worked. Stories told by elders about settlers learning from failure, about cabins redesigned after harsh winters revealed weaknesses. Survival was rarely perfect on the first attempt. Knowledge grew from mistakes. She wondered whether the previous builders survived their own winter or whether this wall was their unfinished lesson left behind. The lamp flame flickered wildly for a moment as a powerful gust forced air through unseen cracks. She shielded it with her hand. Darkness threatened constantly now. Losing light would make everything harder. The stones radiated less heat than before, yet the warmth spread more evenly across the small living space she created. The difference gave her strength. She realized she was no longer merely waiting for survival, but actively shaping it. Still, uncertainty remained heavy. Even with improved heat flow, the temperature continued its slow decline. Dawn felt impossibly far away. Fatigue weighed on her thoughts. She sat briefly, leaning against the wall, eyes half closed. Images drifted through her mind of earlier days in the cabin when firelight filled the room easily. The contrast sharpened her determination. She refused to let this place defeat her. Another loud impact sounded outside, followed by deep silence that lasted several seconds before the wind resumed. Something large had fallen nearby, perhaps a tree burdened by ice. The isolation deepened further. Help would not come soon even after the storm ended. She forced herself to stand again. The carved piece suggested one final adjustment she had not yet tried. The pattern showed a curved extension near the stove's position. She hesitated, uncertain whether moving stones closer to the damaged iron was safe. After a moment's thought, she decided the risk was necessary. Carefully, she added stones around the base of the stove without touching the cracked metal. She shaped them into a shallow arc facing the room, mirroring the carving's design. The arrangement created a channel between iron and stone. She stepped back and watched. At first, nothing happened. Then the faint residual warmth trapped within the stove began transferring into the surrounding stones. The change was subtle but real. Heat that would have vanished into cold air now flowed into the wall. Her breath caught with sudden hope. The wall was reclaiming the last warmth of the stove. She sat close again, feeling the temperature stabilize slightly, not warm, not comfortable, but survivable. The stones glowed faintly under lamplight, holding the final memory of fire. The storm outside continued without mercy, yet inside the cabin a fragile balance formed between cold and heat. Time crawled forward. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she forced herself to stay awake by shifting position often. The warmth remained steady but thin, like standing beside embers long after flames disappeared. She listened carefully to every sound, measuring danger through silence and movement alike. The cabin held together. The stones continued working. The night stretched endlessly. Then, just as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, a new sound reached her ears. A deep rumble beneath the wind, distant but growing. Not thunder, not falling branches. Something heavier moving across frozen ground. She held her breath, listening harder. The sound came again, closer this time, carrying through the storm like a promise or a warning. The lamp flame trembled, and shadows shifted across the stone wall. She rose slowly, heart pounding, unsure whether hope or fear guided her steps toward the door. Outside, beyond snow and darkness, something approached through the storm while inside the last stored heat fought to keep her alive long enough to see what came next. The sound outside grew clearer, pushing through the roar of wind and blowing snow. It came in steady intervals, heavy and deliberate, not the random chaos of the storm. She stood frozen near the door, unsure whether to hope or prepare for disappointment. Her hand hovered over the latch while her heart beat loud enough to drown her thoughts. Another rumble followed, closer now, accompanied by a faint metallic clatter. Then came a dull thud against the outer wall, followed by silence so sudden it felt unreal. Even the storm seemed to pause for a moment. She opened the door carefully, pushing against packed snow. Cold air rushed inside, sharp and biting, stealing breath from her lungs. Beyond the doorway, shapes shifted through swirling white. At first she saw nothing clearly, only movement and shadow, then a lantern glow appeared. A figure struggled forward through the snowdrift, leading a sturdy horse hitched to a small sled piled with supplies. The person raised an arm, shielding their face from the wind, and called out something the storm nearly swallowed. Relief surged through her so strongly her knees weakened. She stepped aside and pulled the door wider. The stranger guided the horse toward the cabin wall and secured the reins quickly before stepping inside, stamping snow from heavy boots. Warm breath filled the air between them as the door shut again, sealing out the storm. For a moment neither spoke. The newcomer looked around the cabin, eyes settling on the failed iron stove, then on the thick stone heat wall glowing faintly beside it. Surprise crossed their face. "You built that," the visitor said, voice rough from cold. She nodded, unsure how to explain everything that had happened. The stranger removed gloves slowly, still studying the wall. "Good thing you did," they said quietly. "This cabin was known for it once. Folks called it a heat wall. Saved lives when stoves failed." The words settled over her like confirmation of something she had felt all night. She held up the carved wooden piece. "I found this. I thought it meant something." The visitor took it carefully and smiled faintly. "Old guide piece. Used to teach how to stack stones, right? Not many remember anymore." They explained that, years ago, settlers in the region built stone heat walls behind iron stoves to store warmth through brutal winters. When metal cracked or fuel ran low, the stones released heat slowly, keeping cabins livable long enough to survive storms. Over time, newer stoves replaced the practice, and knowledge faded as families moved away. The previous occupants, it seemed, had known the method well. The drawing she discovered and the carved piece were left intentionally for whoever came next, a quiet inheritance rather than forgotten debris. The visitor had been checking distant cabins after hearing reports of the severe storm approaching. Travel was dangerous, but experience told them isolated homes needed watching during winters like this one. When they reached her clearing, they noticed faint warmth escaping from the chimney earlier in the evening, enough to suggest someone still lived there. Now, seeing the broken stove and glowing stones, they shook their head with admiration. "You figured it out on your own." Not many would. Together they unloaded supplies from the sled, bringing in dry wood, tools, and a small portable heater designed for emergencies. The added warmth felt almost unreal after hours of uncertainty. As the heater began working safely away from the damaged stove, the cabin slowly regained life. She sank into a chair near the stone wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The stranger brewed hot tea using melted snow, and steam filled the air, carrying comfort deeper than warmth alone. For the first time since the storm began, her hands stopped trembling. Outside, the wind gradually softened. The worst had passed without her noticing. Morning arrived slowly, gray light filtering through frost-covered windows. Snow lay deep across the clearing, reshaping the land into smooth white hills. The storm had left silence behind, peaceful and wide. The cabin felt different in daylight. The stone heat wall stood strong, its purpose undeniable now. The broken iron stove looked smaller, no longer the sole guardian of warmth but part of a larger system she finally understood. With tools from the sled, the visitor examined the stove carefully. The crack had spread beyond safe repair for immediate use, but temporary sealing could prevent further damage until proper fixing became possible. They worked side by side, patching what they could and clearing ash, while sunlight slowly strengthened outside. As they worked, she felt a quiet pride growing within her. The wall she built out of simple observation had truly saved her. Not through luck alone, but through patience, effort, and willingness to learn from the cabin itself. By midday, faint smoke rose safely from the chimney again as a small controlled fire burned under careful watch. The stones absorbed heat eagerly, returning to their steady rhythm. Warmth filled the room gradually, wrapping around them both. They shared a meal near the wall, speaking about winters, travel routes, and forgotten skills once common across the countryside. She listened closely, realizing how much knowledge lived in ordinary people rather than books. Survival here depended on attention, memory, and respect for nature's patterns. When the visitor prepared to leave the following day, the sky had cleared completely. Sunlight sparkled across untouched snow, and the forest stood calm as if the storm had never existed. Before departing, the stranger handed the carved wooden piece back to her. "Keep it visible," they said. "Someone else may need to learn someday." She placed it carefully on the mantel near the stone wall where firelight could touch it every evening. Life in the cabin changed after that winter night. She repaired and strengthened the heat wall further, shaping it exactly as the carving instructed. The stove was eventually restored, but she never again relied on it alone. Each fire she lit now fed both flame and stone, storing security for hours yet to come. Neighbors from distant cabins began visiting when weather allowed, drawn by stories of the heat wall that saved a life during the Great Storm. She showed them how the stones worked, explaining airflow, heat storage, and careful stacking. Old knowledge returned through shared conversation, spreading quietly from one household to another. The cabin no longer felt isolated. It felt connected to generations who learned through hardship and passed lessons forward without expecting recognition. Sometimes, during quiet evenings, she would sit beside the warm stones and remember the moment when fear nearly overtook her. She realized survival had come not from strength alone but from curiosity and trust in small observations. A simple idea, carrying stones indoors one by one, became the difference between danger and safety. The heat wall stood as proof that solutions often begin with noticing what others overlook. Seasons changed again. Spring melted the heavy snow, revealing earth dark and alive beneath. Summer warmed the stones naturally, and autumn returned with golden light across the clearing. When the first frost arrived the following year, she greeted it without fear. The cabin held warmth differently now, balanced between iron, stone, and understanding. On cold nights, the fire burned steadily while the wall absorbed its energy, releasing gentle heat long after flames faded. The room remained warm through early morning hours, just as those who built the cabin long ago intended. She often thought about how close she came to losing everything that stormy night. Instead, she gained something lasting, confidence shaped by experience and a deeper connection to the land and its quiet wisdom. Travelers passing through sometimes stopped to rest and hear the story. She never told it as a tale of danger, but as a lesson in paying attention, in respecting old methods that carried truth even when forgotten. The stone heat wall became more than a structure. It became a symbol of resilience, patience, and the way human hands can work with nature rather than against it. And each winter thereafter, when wind rose and snow gathered against the cabin walls, warmth remained steady inside, spreading slowly from stone to air, reminding her that survival often begins with a simple act done without knowing its future importance. The storm that once threatened her life became the reason the cabin truly became home.